So following Officer Tippett's, the shooting of Officer Tippett, I'm going to track or tell you about Oswald's actions between the time he shot the officer and ended up getting arrested here at the theater. After dropping his jacket behind this gas station, he made his way to Jefferson Boulevard, and there were witnesses who saw him running down the alley behind the gas station and behind the parking lot, and that saw him hit Jefferson Boulevard. And apparently he was running at one point because the police radio reported or announced that there was a man running west on Jefferson Boulevard from the address of 400 East Jefferson, which is this gas station's location. And at 1:20, that was at 1:24. At 1:22, the police radio had reported that an officer had been shot. So that's just 2 minutes later, and very soon after that, the sirens could be heard and police cars were starting to converge upon Jefferson Boulevard. And Oswald was either running or walking at that point, and he had 8 blocks to go between his location at the gas station and the theater. And during those 8 blocks, I'm sure he was a little bit concerned for his whether he was going to get arrested or not, but he apparently ducked into a little vestibule at a shoe store, at Harvey's shoe store. And that's where Johnny Brewster saw him in the vestibule looking through the windows, but he didn't come into the store. He was just looking, window shopping, I guess. And Brewer noticed that he looked very nervous and kind of disheveled, like he had been running. And since Brewer had been listening to the radio, as you just heard, he was aware of both the JFK shooting and Officer Tippett's, or an officer's shooting. So he was kind of on high alert. And of course, sirens were going off, and it was noisy, and everybody was stepping out of their shop to see what was going on. And so he felt that this person was suspicious. But he noticed that Oswald sort of turns his head to the back or toward Jefferson, and then immediately left the vestibule. So he decides, he doesn't know exactly where he's going at that point, but he decides that he's going to follow Oswald, or follow this suspicious looking man. And so he comes out of his shop onto the street, turns to the right, and sees Oswald slip into the theater, or walk into the theater. At that point, the theater ticket taker is also on the street. Like I said, I guess everyone was on the street when the sirens were going off, and all the shopkeepers and employees were on the street. And a woman named Julia Postal was the ticket taker at the time, and Brewer came up to Julia Postal and asked her if she had noticed if this man that he described had bought a ticket. And she said, no, as a matter of fact, he didn't. So that made Brewer even more suspicious, so he decided to go inside the theater and try to locate the gentleman. And Julia Postal then called the police, oddly enough. So this is what the theater looked like at that time, and the interior of the lobby. Once the police were called, it was only a couple of minutes before they arrived on the scene. And they entered the theater both from the front and the back. So there's an alley behind the theater. They came in through these doors backstage. And, oh, I'm sorry, is it that side? Sorry. And also came in to the auditorium from the back and from the balcony. And they asked that the house lights be turned on. So obviously Oswald at this point was aware that the police were here. And I guess he was sitting, if I can get this right, in the 5th seat from the aisle, and the 3rd row from the back of the theater. It almost looks like somebody may be sitting there, but I know the seats have been reconfigured, so the exact location isn't there anymore anyway. So once the police have the lights on and they're talking to the individuals that are in the theater, one of the policemen, Officer McDonald, comes up to Oswald and asks him to stand up. And Oswald does, and he puts his hands in the air, and that's when he says, well, something like, well, it's all over now. And he then immediately follows that with a punch in the officer's face, apparently. And there's a scuffle that ensues, and apparently there is a gun involved in that, but it doesn't go off. And of course, very quickly, the rest of the officers that are in the theater are able to overtake Oswald, and then they officially arrest him at 1:50 that afternoon. And this is what, of course, the theater was like outside, with all the sirens going off, with people knowing about the shooting of the president, and some people also knowing about the shooting of the officer, but mostly because of the president. There's a huge crowd built up. There's a huge crowd outside of the theater when they bring Oswald out. He's doing a little bit of kicking and screaming as he leaves, claiming police brutality. And this is kind of the scene that ends up being documented in the news and in the newspapers and in all the media documentation of what was happening. The theater was listed on the National Register in 2004. That's the National Register of Historic Places. And it was listed as having national significance for its association with the Kennedy assassination story. But it was also listed for its architectural significance as a local theater. It was built in 1931 and was designed by a well-known theater designer, W. Scott Doon, who designed theaters all over Texas and Oklahoma. And you can see how magnificent it was when it opened in 1931. Oops. By the time Oswald came to the theater in 1963, it looked like this. It had changed somewhat. The brickwork had been painted over, so you lost some of the character of the brick. The Campanile Tower on the left is still there, painted over. The sign, the Texas sign has changed. The ticket booth has changed, and the marquee. So it's changed considerably, but it still has the same form as it did originally. And then by 2003 or so, when this photograph was taken, at the time that the building was listed on the National Register, the Campanile was gone. Not only was there paint on the facade, but now it was stucco, which is very difficult to get off. The E and the Texas sign is gone, and the marquee is gone, and so it was in pretty bad shape by this time. And this is when the Oak Cliff Foundation of the Oak Cliff Chamber of Commerce took over the building and took on the task of coming up with a preservation plan for it, and then implementing phase 1 of that plan. And the plan was to restore the building to its 1963 appearance, the appearance that coincided with its national significance. And they proceeded to do phase 1 of that work, which was fairly substantial, but not enough to completely restore everything. So, for example, the Campanile that you saw in the earlier photograph was not able to be reconstructed. But they did do the sign was restored, and the marquee, and the entry area, and there were all sorts of other necessities that had to be taken care of, such as roofs and that sort of thing. The interior of the theater, when Oswald was here, had its original interior. These photographs, of course, show what it looks like now, and since you've all been in the lobby, you've probably seen some of the little exposed areas where you can see the original design beneath the stucco. The white stucco was installed less than a year after Oswald was apprehended here. And it's not uncommon with historic buildings where a negative event occurs for the owners to want to kind of erase that by completely changing the appearance. And that's certainly what happened here. But luckily, it's basically a matter of they've used metal lath and plaster or stucco over all the surfaces, but the original materials are generally still there, behind that. And if you look around the lobby carefully, of course, you'll see a lot of examples of where it's been opened up so you can see what it looked like. One of the areas that was not touched in the 1964 renovation when they put all that plaster in were the 3 little offices at the front of the building that have the little pointed arches. Those are still as they were originally. A floor that's also completely original. This is what this Texas theater may have looked like, or at least it's similar. This is the Texas Theater in San Angelo, which was also designed by Dune, the same architect that designed this theater. This was built in 1929, so just 2 years earlier. And it has the same theme. The theme that was described for this theater was Venetian. And the descriptions talk about not only Venetian balconies and bridges, but also twinkling lights in the ceiling and the sound of water. So the idea with an atmospheric theater, of course, is to create a different atmosphere and to take you away from where you are into another place. And this is a historic photograph of that theater in San Angelo, which is similar to this theater. And if you look around the room, you can see some of the indentations and things in the walls, and those are areas where they would have had sort of a set design. This is the San Angelo Theater as it existed in about 2003. These are very dark photographs because the building was empty and there was no lighting available, but you can see, it's a little fuzzy too, I think, sorry, what it looked like. There's another one. And a couple of details and the theater on the exterior, and this theater's in downtown San Angelo. Another example of an atmospheric theater, one of the better examples, is the Majestic Theater in San Antonio, designed by John Emerson, who's another very well-known architect who did this sort of theater. And the Majestic Theater in Dallas is very similar to this. I couldn't find a really good photograph of the one in Dallas, but it's similar to this one. So this theater falls into that family of atmospheric theaters. And that is what it looked like when Oswald was apprehended here. But thankfully, even though a full restoration hasn't happened, the theater, most importantly, is being used, which means that its preservation is more secure in the long run. So back to Oswald. After he was apprehended, by 1:51, the police radio announced that he was on his way to police headquarters, which is the Dallas Municipal Building, which is your next presentation.